Hello, everybody, and welcome to this webinar on flood risk and resilience under climate change. It's a pleasure to welcome you all here to this webinar hosted by the Grantham Research Institute at the London School of Economics. I'm Swenja. I'm Managing Director for Climate and Sustainability at Marsh, McLennan, Adaptation, and I also hold a research role at the Grantham Research Institute. We're here to look at the topic of flood risk and flood resilience from different angles. And I'm very pleased and very excited to have a very high profile and very experienced group of panelists with me here. With all of them, I have the pleasure of working actually very closely. So I was jokingly introducing this as my flood risk dream team, but in a way it is. And I'm really pleased because I think we're all bringing different perspectives and different angles to this really important topic. This event will be 1 hour long. We are recording it and we will try and make it available afterwards as a recording. We will start with brief interventions from the speakers. They will be using slides, and I would encourage the audience to use the question and answer function on this webinar throughout the session. We will, because we have a very sort of tight schedule, we will go through the presentations first, but then we will have a chance to do a discussion, and I will come back to the questions that you're putting into the chat. So please, into the question and answer function. So please use that because we also want to obviously make this as interactive as possible. I don't think that, the urgency and the scale of the flooding issue has escaped many people. You basically just have to watch the news, and it has become a global problem. We all have seen the pictures from Pakistan. We've seen it basically around the world. We've seen it in Australia. We've seen it in the US. We are seeing it in Europe. And I think, there are obviously efforts to help us to prepare for flood. But at the same time, we're also increasing our understanding what the future risk profile is going to look like and the risk trends and drivers. And the picture that is emerging is actually not a very promising one. And we see that a lot of communities, a lot of countries, a lot of cities that are already struggling with flooding are likely to be exposed and more vulnerable going forward. So that puts a lot of challenges onto governments, to communities, also industry, and including the insurance industry, in terms of trying to keep risks manageable and make sure that individuals and companies can also cope with risk, but at the same time also recognizing that, and for certain region, protection is unlikely to be an option, and there will have to be difficult choices about moving away, relocating. So this is an urgent topic, but it's also a topic where a lot of knowledge exists and insight exists, and where also some promising advances have been made. And I think that's really also the spirit of this session here, to learn, to also get insights from recent events, from the science, and understand, what the trends are, but then also really to focus on, what's next, how we can bring solutions to the table and scale up efforts to increase flood resilience. So my ambition with this event is that at the end, and I'm looking also at the panelists here, that we come up with a list of, sort of quick solutions and big solutions, because I think, this is not going to be a session where we can just admire the problem, but I think it needs to be focused on where next and what needs to change to address this challenge. So I hope that all of you will use the question and answer function. So let's make it as interactive as possible. And with that, I would like to hand over to our first speaker. As I said, I've got the pleasure of working with all of the speakers here on this topic. So for me, it's really exciting to see them here. But yeah, please, Claudio, you're first on the list. If you would like to briefly introduce yourself and then share your slides. And again, welcome for joining us. Thank you.
Definitely. Thank you, Swenja, and good morning and good afternoon, everybody. I'm Claudio, and I work as a research manager at Marsh, McLennan Advantage. Together with Swenja, we produce analysis, studies, reports on various topics of strategic interest to clients, including climate change and climate resilience. And we have been working quite a bit on physical risks in this last few months, in particular flooding. Now, I will share my screen, and we would like to open this webinar with a few considerations from our flood risk index. You should be able to see my screen. Now, this tool offers was developed by our team to provide a global overview of flood risk. It was initially developed for client engagement, but it turned out to be a fairly useful technical exercise, leveraging peer-reviewed, publicly available data sets to develop a comprehensive perspective on how flood risk is distributed globally and how it will evolve under future climate change conditions. Now, to give you some context, the flood risk index accompanies Rethinking Flood, which is a series we've been working together with other colleagues in the team, examining the implications of flood risk for a broad range of stakeholders. The first output in the series is sunk costs, discussing the socioeconomic impacts of flooding with a focus on flood risk as a driver of inequality. And this was later followed by Preparing for a Wetter World, analyzing and presenting strategies for corporate flood resilience. We're currently working on the final output in the series on the future of flood risk management, looking at current inadequacies and future innovations. Now, the flood risk index, the tool is based on a very commonly utilized conceptual framework. So we can think about flood risk somehow as the product of hazard, exposure, and vulnerability. Hazard is essentially a measure of the potential threats in terms of severity and likelihood of flooding. Exposure, a measure of the percentages of people and assets in harm's way. And vulnerability is a measure of how bad things get when flooding hits. This is a screenshot from the tool that is available online. So we simply decided to provide a very simple global perspective of flood risk with scores ranging from 1 to 10 at the country level. So a very first order approach, a first high level view of flooding globally. The users can visualize scores for hazard, exposure, and vulnerability, as you can see in the 3 tabs above. And the hazard scores were derived from a 100-year return period hazard information. In the case of the riverine and coastal datasets, we relied on the World Resources Institute aqueduct floods data, whereas for the pluvial component, we developed our own view using various observational datasets and CIMIP5 models. The tool also has this toggle, and the user can visualize how flood risk changes over time in its 3 components: hazard, exposure, and vulnerability. When clicking on a country, the user can visualize the scores, and this also serves as a tool to compare across countries or between individual countries and country groups. So we can look at regional averages, Europe in this example, but we also have country groups by income levels. Exposure based on human and economic data is essentially, exposure scores are essentially based on the percentages of people and assets exposed to flood risk, whereas the vulnerability component of the index, both in its human and economic components, is based on various proxy indicators, measuring at country level, measuring and quantifying vulnerability of both populations and assets. Now, the tool also presents the global distribution of areas exposed to riverine, coastal, and rainfall flooding, together with distribution of urban and rural areas, as well as critical infrastructure. So as you can see here, we have power plants together with ports and airports. When clicking on a country, as in this example, the user can visualize the percentages of urban and rural areas and assets at risk. And obviously, there are a number of caveats to this result linked to the methodological approach that we chose. But one of the critical messages here is that flood risk will increase substantially over time. And this highlights the fact that business as usual flood resilience will really not be enough in many regions of the world going forward. And about this, going back to the index, there are obviously various metrics that the index provides in terms of people exposed, asset exposed. Here, for reference, just in this slide, I'm focusing on our estimates on the percentages of power generation, air capacity, international airport capacity, and international port outflows threatened by flooding under present-day conditions and in a 2-degree warming scenarios. And you can see that in our analysis, according to our analysis, these percentages will essentially more or less double in the next years and decades. Now, these results really highlight the need for a more systematic approach to climate adaptation and disaster management. Efforts to decarbonize are critical, and the conversation, as I would say, in these last few years, primarily focused on climate mitigation, but it should be accompanied by resources and a lot of thinking dedicated to climate adaptation as well, meaning essentially measures to reduce exposure and vulnerability in addition to the hazard component. And notoriously, this is a good investment. There have been a number of estimates thrown around, but a reliable one, a pretty solid estimate, is that for every dollar invested in resilience, at least $5 are saved. So to recap, really, a final slide, in light of this, the tool, the index, also provide in its resilience section a classification and an overview of resilience measures ranging from more traditional options such as engineered solutions to more innovative solutions such as the use of new technologies, monitoring technologies to improve on early warning systems or risk transfer solutions. Now, the key message here is that the status quo flood risk management is not enough. There are still many major points of failure, and also linked very often to ineffective or lacking or lack of risk governance. And well, going forward, innovation of flood risk management will need to rely on the expansion of both financial and technical capacity and on a new culture of collaboration among stakeholders. Effective flood risk management will require both a whole of society approach and will need to be context dependent, keeping in mind that in many cases there won't be a silver bullet, but a portfolio of solutions will be needed. And that's pretty much it. I'll pass it, just stop sharing my screen.
Thank you, Claudio. Thank you. I think that sets the scene quite nicely. And obviously, we've seen the climate change sort of drivers, other risk drivers obviously also play a part here, and the need for holistic response. And I think, Michael, that is exactly what you've been spending a lot of your working life on. And you know, I'm really pleased that you're able to share with us some of your insights, particularly also from the review of the recent floods in last year's floods in Germany. So over to you, Michael, and welcome to the webinar.
Thank you very much, Swenja. It's a pleasure to be here. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. And mille grazie, Claudio, for passing on the ball so nicely. I mean, we squarely work in adaptation, and also for quoting, you know, the 1 in 5, which we've been using or also trying to validate as well. So my name is Michael Swenja. I work as the Flood Resilience Program Lead at Zurich Insurance Group, and in that function, I'm also responsible for the Zurich Flood Resilience Alliance already mentioned. So as Swenja introduced, we'll be looking at one case study from the weather system Bernd, and based on the question that has been put forth, is Europe up to the job? I'll try to come up with 3 hypotheses based on our review that we've done, which you can also read obviously as the full report, which I would like you to invite to do. So 3 hypotheses. The first one is, was this really so unimaginable, and what conclusions can we draw from that? The second is around the intensity of the event, and it was often said that, you know, if it's so bad, then you can't really do anything about it. Is that really true? And then thirdly, you know, looking forward, people are, however, quite confident that this will never happen again. So we should take a look whether that is true as well, or whether we need to do the job in future slightly differently. And you have to link there to the full report as well. Really quickly, in terms of context, PERC is part of our flood resilience program, and we've done roughly 25 of those around the world. And many things we keep, you know, seeing insights and evidence keeps coming back. So while we want to use this as an opportunity to learn, you can consider Bernd alongside many others also as a synthesis of many findings we've seen over the past 10 years or so. And the reason we're doing this is really fully rooted in the UNDRR framework, because essentially it requires and mandates us to do learning and to share learning so we can improve policy and decision making. But over to the content. We've heard it over and over and over again that this was a flood like it had never been seen before. And if you look at the stats of the last 20 years or so, then you see the 2021 flood level, or rather the flow level, and you see what was defined as the 100-year flood, a quite defining flood event in 2016, at least for the Ahr Valley in Germany. But we should remind ourselves that this event affected quite a large part of Western Europe. So you could think this is 5 times as big as, you know, this defining 100-year flood. So clearly it's, you know, completely unimaginable. But it's really a short time series. So maybe we should look at the full picture, and we see both the measured and as well the historically documented events. And you clearly see that at least 2 have been significantly bigger than the 100-year definition in 1910 and then in 1804. And these are very well defined flood events. They've just not been measured with, you know, the instruments that we use today, but they're, you know, documented, chronicled, it's heavily written about. So clearly the conclusion here is that if we don't really understand even the full spectrum of the past events, how can we possibly take the right decisions for what the level of flood risk management should be? And I think it's especially true that we need to make sense of what's coming. So we need to better anticipate the future flood risk under climate change scenarios. And I underline scenario in the sense that we need to come up with better scenario thinking of what might happen in the future. So the second hypothesis, well, you know, if the event is so big, then, you know, we are unable to protect ourselves adequately. And again, you know, I think we can refute this hypothesis and say that is not necessarily true. First of all, because it is not really rocket science. The technology exists, the solutions exist, we can really protect ourselves. And actually, I think we need to stress and motivate people that solutions can easily and in a cost-effective way, 1 in 5 cost benefit refers, we can implement these. But I think the point, it is really urgent, and we don't really have time to lose here, especially as we need to think about how long infrastructure, in particular critical infrastructure, will live. We're building the built environment that will be there in 2050 now. So the decisions, you know, what these buildings, this infrastructure, these services need to be adapted to, need to be taken now. We can't wait any longer. And I think it's really urgent that we understand the key processes upon which we need to base our decisions. And you see, you know, 5 elements there. One is controlling the exposure. Simply don't build new construction in exposed zones, and don't make too many exceptions. So that's clearly a policy advice that, yeah, we draw flood zones and we understand where floodwaters might go, and then we have 10,000 reasons why we make exceptions to allow still to build in there. I think that is just a bad, policy choice. And there were some technical aspects where solutions exist, but understanding needs to improve around the flood process itself, especially the jamming that we've seen around bridges in some of these valleys. That disaster law, so especially the response part, was not fit for the scenarios in Western Europe. We've simply been too calm and probably too comfy in the last couple of decades. And one of the things we've seen in all of our post-event reviews was the failure of critical infrastructure, leading to cascading effects. So a lack of understanding how vulnerable critical infrastructure is and what the subsequent consequences will be. So hopefully some practical ideas there. And then last not least, are we now really taking the decisions that this will never happen again? And I just want to remind you of the case of Grimma. So those that are not familiar, please do look it up. Fairly interesting, but also sad story to some extent, when the town of Grimma first flooded in 2002, and people, were so flabbergasted by what had happened that they were really, motivated to take action and make it never happen again. And then all of the reality comes in, all of the different, obstacles that you have to overcome, especially these competing interests from various actors. And in 2013, we had almost, the same situation again. So it was again Grimma. And I think that is almost my, worst nightmare in terms of, what could happen to the R Valley, that in 10 years, we have the same situation again, because the different elements that need to come together at the moment are just not, there to make the big change that is needed to update the flood risk management at that level. Yes, we do see movement. We see movement in many places, but it's so small and so incremental that it's really a false sense believing that, all these small steps are enough. A bigger step change is really needed. So these are my three, aspects. There's lots of, further recommendations in here, but essentially, investing in flood risk management and resilience building is a good thing. It's an investment. It's not a cost. It works, and it's really relevant for us. And there's many areas like the R Valley in Western Europe where this could occur, and we really need to anticipate this as well. So with this, I close and hand over to you, Swenja, again. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much, Michael. And yes, I mean, we've been working very closely with you, and the Grantham Research Institute is a member of the Zurich Flood Resilience Alliance. And we will now hear from two colleagues who have been conducting research, but also in a very engaged way, working with communities as part of that program. So I would like to hand over to Victor Rosa, who's going to share some thoughts about also the implications in terms of, where people live and what that means in terms of environmental justice. Over to you, Victor.
Yeah, thank you, Swenja. Hi, everyone. My name is Victor Rosa. I'm a research fellow at the Grantham Research Institute at LSE, and I've worked on various aspects of physical risk from climate change, and particularly on flooding. And today I would like to take a step back to what my previous presenters have shown, and also what Michael has shown, and sort of like the creation of exposure. And I want to present a short case study on England and Wales, where we looked into how new build homes actually contribute to the flood risk problem, and also the environmental justice issues that come with it, depending on where they're built. I won't stick too long with this graph. You've seen this now in various versions. I just want to briefly give you the UK context. So when we talk about exposure, we have currently 5.2 million properties in England are at risk of flooding. That's roughly 17% of all properties. It's the flooding is a natural hazard with the highest economic damage. So we talk about vulnerability. It's on average 0.7 billion per year on the long-term average. And sort of like we've seen an increasing flood risk over the last decades in the UK, mainly driven by an increase in exposure, so like more properties built in areas at risk of flooding. But there's also a real concern about sort of like that this will be overtaken by an increase in or like a factor of climate change increasing or driving the risk. So what we've asked ourselves in this research piece is that we have like this high level figure between 2008 and 2018, like 120,000 new homes have been built in areas at risk of flooding in England and Wales. And as you can see below, some of them have even flooded during the construction phase, which is both sad and quite ironic. What we've tried to answer is like first, which is not sort of like as obvious as like where these homes are located. So we try to find like better data where we can like identify these homes that are at risk of flooding and how over the lifetime of these buildings, like Michael has mentioned, sort of like what we've built today is still there in 2050, and how does affect how are they affected by climate change. And we're also looking in sort of like which neighborhood they have been built in, and sort of like to get like kind of like a robust forward-looking estimate of these neighborhoods. We looked at sort of like trajectory data going all the way back to 1961, and basically over the last 50 years or so, basically looking into sort of like how neighborhoods have developed and what trajectory they are, because we don't know like how a neighborhood specifically look into in the future, but we kind of can make like reasonable assumptions on like the trajectory they currently are, that they roughly remain on that trajectory. And we basically see in England and Wales like both like stable, upward, and sort of like downward sort of like trajectories of community development. For the climate change, we've considered like different scenarios. We looked into like the 2-degree scenario, like a 4-degree scenario, and sort of like some credible like worst case scenario for different regions and flood types. And sort of like the way we did it, you see on the right, we defined like smaller like local impact areas, and we've looked into sort of like how those are likely to change, and particularly sort of like how the flood zones might shift, and sort of like the annual risk of flooding. And we particularly looked in sort of like the 1% and higher annual chance of getting flooded in an area. When we look at sort of like the spatial trends today, what we see sort of like on the left, you see sort of like the absolute figures. There's like a lot of new built areas in at-risk areas in London, because simply there's like where most of new buildings have been built over in this area. But if you sort of like look into like absolute terms, what you see on the right, it's especially sort of like in the east coast of England and sort of like the East Midlands, where we see a lot of this areas where like a really high share of new built homes are built in areas at risk of flooding. Also partly because there is simply no other place there to build. So, I mean, this is like really an area that will be like severely affected by flooding. And if you look into the future, I mean, this will only increase. So like if you look sort of like at the 2-degree scenario, we've already seen sort of like, especially in the East Midlands, around sort of like the Thames Valley, and also sort of like in Yorkshire, along the Ouse River, we see sort of like increases. And this is only getting worse. And you can really see there's like quite a big difference between the 2 and the 4-degree scenario, which kind of like really gives us sort of like, should give us a real motivation why it really makes sense to stay below 2 degrees, because it's only becoming worse from there. None of this is probably a big surprise. You've probably seen this in different versions. But what we found quite surprising is sort of like, why we see sort of like of these new built homes, when they contribute to the overall exposure, it means they make the cake bigger. So like the risk cake becomes bigger. But at the same time, sort of like how we distribute the risk among different groups of population of this growing risk cake is actually quite interesting. Because if you look at sort of like one of these areas, sort of like the dotted vertical line like marks sort of like will be perfectly proportionate, and if you go like below, your risk is proportionate lower, and if you go like to the right and you're blue, then sort of like you're higher. So that what we see here is that increasing struggling homeowners, so like people who like have problems affording their mortgages and so on, that they are currently sort of like underrepresented proportionately. But if you look in all climate change scenarios, sort of like their share of the overall risk is actually increasing. So the areas where these new built homes are built in increasing struggling homeowner areas are actually taking a much larger share of the growing risk. Same is for stable multicultural urban communities and sort of like aging manual labor communities. On the upside, on the other side, we see sort of like upward and thriving communities and stable and affluent communities. There we actually see sort of like that proportionate, their risk is becoming smaller with climate change. So like once we sort of like hit like sort of like if in case of a 4-degree scenario, like the upward and thriving trajectories communities actually see quite a significant lower share of the risk. I mean, there's still growing risk, but they get a lower share. So in conclusion, the total increase in exposure to flooding of new built properties is significant, and we have sort of like not only a growing sort of like risk, but we also from exposure, but we also have exacerbating existing inequalities between struggling and affluent neighborhoods. There's like we see like a real risk in sort of like an increase in things like mortgage defaults, foreclosures. You see like some of the recent shocks on sort of like interest rates and so on. I mean, that all adds to it. And once we see a flood event, we might see like real problems in these areas for financial recovery in case of a flood event. What we argue for is that we need like new metrics that take these effects into account. Then we look like not only at current risk, but also in forward risk, and how sort of like building or creating new risk actually affects sort of like the neighborhood development in conjunction with climate change to inform spatial planning decisions. So very much also what we've seen in Michael's presentation. If we don't want to repeat mistakes, we really have to take a forward-looking approach. And with that, I would like to thank you and would like to pass on to Swenja and our next speaker, Sarah, who is like sort of like tells us hopefully a bit of like a more hopeful message from the ground on the east coast of England.
Okay, thank you very much, Victor. And yes, I would like to hand over to colleague Sarah Meyer, who is also a member of the Grantham Research Institute and works on the Zurich Flood Resilience Alliance team. I think, Sarah, you can tell us a little bit more about how these things look locally because you've been spending a lot of time with communities, particularly on the East Coast, with communities that are exposed to flooding, have experienced flooding, but also face significant economic challenges. So over to you, Sarah, and please share your thoughts.
Yeah, thank you, Swenja. Thank you very much. Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Sarah Mehyar. I'm a research officer in Grantham Research Institute at LSE, and I'm happy to share a little bit about a project that we've implemented together with the local authority in the east coast of England to understand flood resilience challenges there and also identify ways to improve flood resilience in this region. So this project was on Lowestoft, which is a port city or town with population of 71,000. And due to its location, Lowestoft is now becoming a major offshore energy hub in the UK, as it's supposed to serve the growing number of wind farms located off the Norfolk and Suffolk coast. And this wind farm project is supposed to regenerate the economy, grow the businesses and create jobs. However, such a big gentrification opportunity is being threatened by different types of flood risks in the residential and businesses areas in Lowestoft. So we applied a resilience measurement tool called Flood Resilience Measurement for Communities, or FRMC, in short, that is developed by Zurich Flood Resilience Alliance. This is another tool in addition to PERC, which was already presented by Michael. And this is similar to PERC, it's been implemented across the world in more than 20 countries, in about 300 communities to measure flood resilience of communities and support decision-making for flood resilience at the local level. And This tool has 44 indicators, meaning that it doesn't only look at the physical protection measures or physical capital, but it also looks at the human, social, financial, and natural capital. And it also looks at the pre-event risk reduction and preparedness activities, as well as the post-event response and recovery activities. We implemented this tool together with the local authorities in a participatory process. So we conducted a series of the focus groups and key informant interviews with the key actors from the community, businesses, and government representatives. We conducted household and business survey and also analyzed the secondary data. And we graded these indicators based on the collected data and in a workshop setting together with the local stakeholders. The outcome of this study showed a major gap in human capital, particularly, which is more related to the lack of knowledge and awareness on the location of properties and businesses that are at risk, at either current and or future risks, which means that like type of studies that Victor and other colleagues are doing are quite important here. But the question is then how much these informations about the location and vulnerability of the properties are being shared and communicated with the local authorities. In addition, there's a lack of awareness about the property protection measures for businesses and households that can be taken to reduce the impact of future floods. We also identified lack of capacities for natural measures, which is due to the mostly concrete urban areas in Lowestoft, and lack of insurance mechanisms for businesses, and particularly for the small and medium-sized businesses in Lowestoft. So the outcome of this project has been used in developing a grant application by the local authority for the new Flood Resilience Innovative Program, which was launched in 2020. And in this proposal, specific actions were designed to address the resilience gaps that had been identified in FRMC project. And Lowestoft was one of the 25 local areas that got this funding for implementing flood resilience interventions. And so what we learned from this project, our observation was that collaboration and communication between the local and national government and between the local authorities and communities is a key in implementing any resilience project. And this collaboration must be throughout the entire process, not only in the implementation phase, but from the beginning, from the assessment, identifying challenges and solutions, planning, and project design to the implementation phase. And it's also quite important to weave resilience projects into existing and ongoing development projects, meaning that the resilience project and development projects should not be in silos, they should go hand in hand. And we also found participatory approach as a quite powerful approach, not only to increase credibility of flood risk management projects, but also to enhance general awareness about flood risk and resilience, and therefore increase public engagement in flood risk management activities. And in terms of the barriers, we still think that most of the resilience programs often stop after the assessment and planning phase. So they are mainly used for raising awareness and sharing information about the resilience challenges and planning for the future, but they rarely support the decision-making and implementation phase, which is quite important, as resilience is a long-term process, and it's not only about creating policies or raising awareness, but it's about how to maintain efforts to build resilience over a long time. And then this might be related to the second point, which is about the lack of methods and tools on measuring and quantifying effectiveness of resilience solutions, and particularly measuring benefits and co-benefits of resilience solutions. And finally, even with the best access to the most recent flood risk models and data, it seems that still decision-making for resilience activities is highly influenced by like the most recent experienced risks, the socioeconomic conditions, public expectations, political values, and ideologies and mass media, which is not a barrier, but it can become a challenge if we look at resilience as a long-term proactive process rather than short-term reactive solutions. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah, for sharing that. And I think this is very important to also keep the local community perspective in mind. And we're now coming to our final speaker, Swenja Kraft. And I'm very pleased, Swenja, that you could join us because you've been working with a lot of communities, but mostly in developing country context. You are sort of leading the four there, but interestingly, you've also recently applied some of the insights to the German situation with a particular focus on insurance. And I think this is an angle that so far we have only touched on. So I'm really looking forward to your input. Over to you, Swenja.
Yeah, hello everyone, and thank you, Swenja, for this kind introduction and invite. Basically, I work for MCI, Munich Climate Insurance Initiative, and we are looking especially on insurance-related tools to protect climate vulnerable communities with a focus on developing countries. And we are also very much linked into the international policy discourse. We were actually approached by the German Environmental Protection Agency to reflect on what is happening at an international level and see whether this can also be used and applied in the German context and for the German adaptation strategy. So we published a report. It's available on the internet, and I will highlight some insights from that report, but I would also want to have some broader level remarks towards the end of my presentation. Was about to say next slide. No, I'm in charge of this. So basically, this is the report, also with a link, and the objective was really to develop also recommendations for the German context based on, as I said, international lessons learned. So we did a deep literature review on what's happening. We did a focus group discussion and also expert interviews. So on the right side, you see the coding framework we use to analyze our interviews, and the survey focused on what are some of the perceived and prioritized hazards, what is the role of insurance instruments, the linkage to risk mitigation measures. We heard about the importance of that early on, but also what are the roles of different actors, different levels of governance. And lastly, are there any thoughts around international experiences, for example, also using parametric insurance approaches for some of the challenges. I won't have time to go through the detailed recommendations of the report. We clustered it in 4 different areas. One is the databases and risk understanding, which needs to be improved. For example, to have like one stop measure to go for your risk understanding, for example, as a private house owner. We were also looking at different sectors, so of course also needs to be sector specific. We also talked about the importance of linking risk provisioning and risk transfer, risk reduction and risk transfer, for example, in the way products are structured, but also in the kind of incentives set through the insurance and the insurance availability. The third point we said was around the insurance penetration and protection level, which in the German context, there are like different ways to organize flood insurance, and the German system is based on a voluntary market approach, and there has been some efforts in the past to increase the penetration level, but it's way too low. I think that was one of the highlights, or one of the takeaways we also took from the focus group discussions. And there are different ways to increase that. For example, talking about the design of insurance, talking about opt-out options, so that the relevant insurance coverage is part of the initial product offering, things like that. But also discussing, for example, questions around mandatory insurance coverage. And then the last point is around, and I heard that word, all of society approach, around the cooperation and dialogue that needs to happen. Also what the role is for the different governance actors. And in the German context, we're talking about a complex multi-level system where, for example, municipal actors have a certain role in risk management, risk reduction, where the federal states have a role, and also the federal level at the country level. And so this needs to work together, but also then actors like the insurance industry, or actors like the science providers, and things like that. So this is how we clustered our recommendations, more detailed in the report. However, what we did do this interviews before the flood happened, actually 2 months before the flood happened. I think a general notion was that people were very unhappy actually and frustrated on how it has developed over the past years. In Germany, we actually had some events, 2002, for example, at the Oder River. There was not much in terms of policy learning coming out of that. And so I think that was among all stakeholders kind of a shared notion. And then after the flood, of course, there was a much bigger debate. The flood itself has been by far biggest insured event in Germany. And also the government had to provide 30 billion in state aid for reconstructing, for example, private homeowners. Very much necessary, but also many of these homeowners didn't have insurance coverage or were underinsured. So after the event, there has been a little spike in terms of insurance demand, but not at the level that this would reach, like the 100% we need. And there has been now a discussion around having a public-private or public scheme on increasing that insurance penetration. We have proposals on the table by the German Insurance Association, but also the Association of the Insured, and now for the first time, I think also the policy level is greenlighting this moving forward, with the federal states not being against mandatory insurance and a new legal framework to be expected by end of 2022. That said, if you look at it, you realize it's actually not only a technical dialogue and discussion that we need to have in order to improve flood resilience. I think that's one of my take-home messages. We have seen, for example, at the international level, the discussions moving from mitigation, I'm not talking risk mitigation, but mitigating climate change, to adaptation, and now to loss and damage. When you look at the adaptation discussion, it was really helpful to also trigger, for example, adaptation strategies in Germany. But looking at that, you realize it's agnostic when it comes to the social question of climate change in Germany. So my question is, and I want to conclude that, do we also need to now include, like we do at the international level with the loss and damage discourse, do we need that actually also in countries of Europe? Do we need to explicitly talk about the contingent responsibilities that exist, the share between the individual and also the society, and also who kind of funds that at the end of the day? Need to have that kind of dialogue also at the national level. With that, thank you, and looking forward to the discussions.
Thank you very much, Swenja, and thank you also for bringing us up to speed on these developments, but then also with a view to, what's going to happen at COP. And you mentioned loss and damage, and I mean, this is an illustration of the issues that we see across the world, and the need to find solutions, fair and equitable, also economically sound solutions. And the good thing, I guess, that we hear, there are, a range of approaches that can be implemented and that are implemented, but obviously the task and the scale is quite significant. So thank you for your inputs here. I recognize we don't have that much time, but I would encourage the audience to share use the question and answer function. I can see one question which has come in, which I would just like to put to the panel, because this is an important point. I mean, we've talked about the cost effectiveness and, this famous, $1 invested saves at least $5. And I think those of us who engage with this are, we have a huge amount of evidence around this, but there are also significant challenges to sort of move from that evidence to build, a business case, to then have instruments that actually work on these benefits. So there was a question from the audience around the tools available for measuring and quantifying the effectiveness. So if I would like to put that to the panel and get some quick reactions. Who would like to come up with some comments? Michael, do you want to start?
Happy to. And obviously, Sarah has already introduced the Flood Resilience Aligned Measurement tool, the FRMC, that was mentioned. I want to point out here is that we are measuring resilience as a indicator of the actions of an event, and independent of individual solutions. So the question indeed is, if we're measuring resilience of a community at a certain point in time, and then things change in between, and you measure again, which is what we're doing. We measure at least baseline and then in our program communities. Then you see some change, but how do you attribute that change to any intervention or any solutions that have been implemented in the meantime? And that's indeed one of the big tricks and challenges in resilience measurement that we're trying to solve. Now, I think it's important to note that it's not a one-on-one relationship. So one intervention will strengthen one indicator, one source of resilience that you measure. It's a one-to-many and a many-to-one relationship. So eventually it turns into a many-to-many relationships, in the sense that one solution that you implement can and hopefully will strengthen several indicators. At the same time, one single solution will not provide the effect of building resilience overall. So you need many solutions, and sometimes you need several steps of solutions that will strengthen one individual factor. So how do you measure that? Well, in the baseline and the endline differential, hopefully you'll see some change. We have a process step where we are assessing how interventions are related to resilient solution. That is as much a thinking and brainstorming step where you try to find the evidence and explain it through adequate rationales than it is, hard science where you can say, oh, this element directly links to that one. I think with the rich concept of resilience, it's not as easy. But again, with hopefully the baseline to endline evaluations, you see some indications what solutions have had an effect. So that's one part of the answer. The second one is essentially simple and good measurement and evaluation of interventions themselves. So I think that's more the effectiveness of solutions part of the question. So has it achieved the objectives that you wanted to achieve? What cost effective did reach the people, or the size of the community you wanted to reach? Is it good quality? There's some basic evaluations of the solutions themselves, and I think the combination of the two will give you some insight whether your solutions are building resilience.
Thank you, Michael, for that. In the interest of time, I'm going to go to the next question. I can encourage the panelists, if you want to, you can also add any links or so into the question and answer and sort of answer it. I can see, I think, Swenja, you appear to be typing an answer. At least it says on my screen that. Then the next question is around, how we sort of bring in coastal erosion and sea level rise in this. And Claudia, maybe I'll put this question to you, because I think that was also part of the update of the flood risk index. I think the key message is, flood comes in different forms and shapes, And we actually need to look at, the interplay between these, and, you need to really look at that, particularly if you have a community that is exposed to all of them. But do you want to say something specific around sea level rise?
Yes, absolutely. So a couple of thoughts. There are obviously a range of tools that can be used here, but the primary tool in this case, especially when it comes to long-term projections of sea level rise, are climate models that project fairly consistently and fairly robustly information on how the sea level will rise. These are, in a sense, measuring the potential impact of chronic trends like sea level rise, for example. It's even simpler than measuring impacts linked to acute events like a flood event that could be linked to extreme rainfall, given the uncertainty linked to the frequency and intensity of these events that doesn't exist, or is at least reduced in the case of chronic trends. A source of uncertainty when it comes to sea level rise is definitely linked to how this is compounded by shoreline erosion, by subsidence. Very often we have fairly limited, or we don't have as sophisticated tools, especially in certain regions, and data to project these trends. And this represents a fairly substantial source of uncertainty there.
Yeah, thanks for that. I mean, I think it is fair to say, particularly with flooding, it's always important to really understand, why does a certain area flood? And, there are a myriad of reasons for why that area floods. And I think that's kind of the understanding. And, obviously the water can come, it comes from the sky, it comes from the river, it comes from the sea. I think, the key message is to look at the trends that are driving these. I think the other observation, and this is something particular when we think about how we respond, you don't have to get your feet wet to be impacted by floods. And I think that's a key message. I think, unfortunately, far too many communities are directly impacted, but even more, I mean, all of us are in a way indirectly exposed, regardless of where you are, because you might depend on infrastructure, you are depending on international supply chains, on trade routes and so on. And I think this is the other point that often is underestimated. And I think as we've seen with some of the stats around infrastructure, it is really important to also sort of factor flooding into the mix here. I can see some comments coming in, and I want to pick up a comment about, the sort of question that often, the cost effectiveness is also time dependent. And I think that is an important point. I don't know if anybody wants to comment on this, because this is also one of the challenges. I mean, some of these resilience solutions will also take some time to be implemented. Some of them will actually only sort of prove their worth, in the case of events. And then there are other solutions that have a lot of co-benefits. So it's actually quite a sort of mix. Victor, do you want to briefly come back on that?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, very briefly. I think we have another question as well, which I thought was quite interesting. I fully agree on sort of like the time dependency. And I think one way I think is that what Swenja mentioned is the co-benefits, that we sort of like split up or find interventions that like deliver immediate benefits independent of there is an event, because that already sort of like pushes us like a bit higher. So I think I fully agree with the point that the more events the more losses are avoided over time, the more cost effective they become. But they come with a range of other benefits. And so I think like looking and sort of like considering these benefits, I think considerably makes a lot of these investments more attractive, because they deliver immediate benefits rather than sort of like waiting for an event. And I think it's also easier for policymakers to basically sell these events, because otherwise you build something and then nothing happens and people ask you, why have you spent like X amount on these flood defenses? We haven't seen a flood.
Okay, well, I'm conscious we're running out of time. There are two other questions there, but very briefly, I mean, Michael, if you can give us, your very quick reaction to that.
No, I mean, absolutely true. And the challenge of measuring the additional benefits is something we've been pondering for a long time, and making sure we somehow quantify is all not easily monetizable, but definitely a more flexible and open approach is something what we need. Maybe one quick add on to Wolfgang's point, and good to see you, everyone. I think there's also a difference between the assumed scenario-based assessment of what cost benefits are when you do decision-making, which is forward-looking scenario-based, and is obviously just based on the statistics. So this is what you think the cost effectiveness is going to be. I think what we see much more rarely is an actual appraisal of how much has to save now. And I think that's maybe more fundamental to your point. I guess we need both. You should do the assessment of what you think the cost benefit is going to be, and then do a reality check after 10, 20, 50 years, like they do with Thames Barrier. How much has it now actually saved? And I think that retrospective look is often forgotten, so that's important. Maybe quickly taking the question from Jacob that I think is addressed to me, and it's an absolutely relevant one, because I think it shows the limits of, you know, what we can protect ourselves to. And I guess one aspect here is that it is to some extent a socio-political decision, what level of risk we actually want to take into consideration, and at what point we say we need to stop, and the asteroid falling onto our head, you know, at some point it becomes a bit an arbitrary, you know, element. But I do think that we need to look at higher risks than what we currently typically do, especially with flooding, because the 100-year time horizon is insufficient. And the second aspect here is that once you can't really protect physically the asset, as in maybe the Magdalena flood, then it's about saving lives and still doing the best you can to, you know, not have your infrastructure crumble. So this is early warning systems. This is risk awareness with the population actually listening and reacting to early warning, which also was one of the shortcomings in the R Valley flood. So making sure that at least, you know, we save lives, and then yes, at some point we can only rebuild.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Michael. And sorry that I have to cut us off here. I know there's also a very interesting question about arid regions, and you know, I was going to go to you, Sarah, to also, because you've also worked in that space, to ask you for questions. So feel free to answer that that in writing. But I think we have to come to conclusion here. So thank you very much. I think we did a good job at not just admiring the problem, but also talking about solutions. So yeah, obviously, you know, there's a lot of work to be done, but it's great to see also, you know, progress, and obviously the task is quite big. So thank you so much to the audience for your time, and to all our panelists, and yeah, see you soon, and stay dry. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.